And so today we're going to look at Hippolytus and go through this. These are just some of the things. There's introduction to the Messiah, the symbols for Christ and the Antichrist, his death, several things like that. So what we're going to do is go to here, which is, we're going to start in chapter 23, I believe. And we're going to see some of the same basic ideas. So here, we're just going to read this. I'm not going to read the whole passages because they're basically, he'll quote almost a whole chapter, and then he'll say, I think this means 1, 2, 3. So we're all very familiar with those chapters. So he's talking about this, the idea of the Daniel's beasts and then Nebuchadnezzar's image and the whole concept of being premillennial. Okay. So he says this in chapter 23 about Daniel's winged lion, which is part of Daniel chapter 7. And I believe if we back up, so the vision of the Messiah. And so he's going to be going through all the different things of chapter 27. I've got it broken up in the way that he divides it, but he gives a slight introduction and then quotes the chapter. And so now he's going to tell us about it. So his comments are this. Now, since these things spoken as they were with a mystical meaning an allegory or symbol, there are no seven-headed red dragons and there are no winged lions. So it means something, is what he's saying. It may seem hard to understand, but we will keep back nothing fitted to impart an intelligent appreciation or apprehension of them to those who are possessed of a sound mind. He said then that a lioness came up from the sea. Lion, or it's a winged lion, and he's in this particular way, he's got it in feminine form, a lioness. So it's a winged lion. And by that he meant the kingdom of the Babylonians in the world. It's the Babylonian empire that took over Israel, where they had the Babylonian captivity, which was also heard of as the gold on the image. So he's telling us it's the same thing. When it says that it had the wings of an eagle, it means Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was lifted up and exalted against God. And when it says the wings thereof were plucked, that is to say, his glory was destroyed. He was driven out of his kingdom. We know that story from Daniel. And the words, a man's heart was given to it, and it was made to stand upright like the feet of a man, on its feet like a man. This refers to the fact that he repented and recognized himself to be only a man and gave glory to God. So no matter how we say that the last pieces are complete or they mean something else or something, two things or whatever, the basic idea behind this is Hippolytus is saying the winged lion and the head of gold is the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so I'm just showing you how we're getting to the belief in the end times being premillennial, pre-trib, this kind of stuff. So here at Daniel's bear, okay, we know that to be Medo-Persia. After the lioness, he sees a second beast like a bear. This denotes the Persians. For after the Babylonians, the Persians held the sovereign power, and saying that there were 3 ribs in its mouth, that'd be the Persians, the Medes, and the Babylonians. A couple of different interpretations on exactly what the ribs mean, which are also represented by the image of silver after the gold. So he's being really consistent here. And then there's the Greece or the leopard. There was then a third beast, a leopard, which is meant the Greeks. For after the Persians, Alexander of Macedon obtained the sovereign power on subverting Darius. This is shown also as the brass in the image. And when you go back to some of the really ancient text, we're talking about copper. So sometimes they'll say brass, sometimes they'll say bronze. They're all copper alloys. And we kind of get caught up on, well, was it brass or bronze? Well, the point is that it's copper based. Okay, and so that the copper is the main idea. But either way, the chest and arms of silver, and then now the belly and thighs of brass represents the Greece kingdom. So very consistent. And when it said it had the 4 wings of a fowl, He taught very clearly that the kingdom of Alexander was partitioned, which it was, into the four pieces. It was Greece proper, Turkey, and then Syria and Egypt. And Turkey and Greece didn't care anything or have anything to do with Israel. Israel kept being pushed back and forth between Syria and Egypt. So those were the two that it worked with. So he says that, and said, for speaking of the four heads, in Daniel's beast, he sees a four-headed leopard. Okay. The four heads, he make mention of the four kings, or the four empires it divided into, that arose out of that kingdom. For Alexander, when dying, partitioned out his kingdom into four divisions. So again, there's a lot more we could talk about, but the basic idea is that he's saying that that next empire is the four-headed leopard in Daniel chapter 7, and it's the copper belly and thighs of brass in Daniel 2. So what we've always been taught, what it means and who it is and the time periods are the same thing that he's agreeing with. Oh yeah, and by the way, we're talking about Hippolytus. So he's writing, all of his stuff is somewhere between 190 and 210 AD. So in that area. So right after Irenaeus's stuff. So then Daniel's nondescript beast. So he says a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, that it had the teeth, iron teeth, and brass claws. Those are the Romans. Okay, and we understand that because Rome was ruling as an empire over Israel when Christ came. We see that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is also meant by the kingdom of iron, the kingdom which is now established, for the legs of that were iron. And at this point, it's still a Roman empire. It hasn't divided into the two legs yet in his time period. That doesn't happen until 395. And again, he's writing around 200. But anyway, either way, he understands this is Rome. So after this, what remains, beloved, but the toes and feet of the image, which are part of iron and part of clay mixed together. This mystically by the toes of the feet, he means the kings who will arise from among them, as Daniel says in these words, and he quotes Daniel, I considered the beast, and lo, there were 10 horns behind it, among which shall arise another horn, an offshoot, small horn, and shall pluck up by the roots 3 that were before it. And under this was signified none other than the Antichrist, who himself would raise the kingdom of the Jews. Now we know Israel is back as a nation, so if he's correct, he's meaning something else, not just that the Antichrist comes on the scene and makes the Jews come back and rebuild their empire, so to speak. So he's meaning something slightly different. He's going to explain it in a minute. But in here, I want you to see this. This is what we've always taught, that these, out of what used to be the Roman Empire, would be these 10 nations, and they come together and they don't agree, and then an 11th nation comes in and takes over, and 3 of them object, and he goes to war with the 3 and destroys them, and then he's the 8th out of the 7 that are left over. And so we see this in Daniel. That's our interpretation, and it's his also. So as we go on, the 3 kingdoms against the Antichrist. So this is where we get a little piece of possibly new information. So he says that the 3 horns that are plucked up by the roots. Now notice this is Hippolytus still talking about Daniel. So he's saying Daniel says, okay? So Daniel says that the 3 horns that are plucked up by the roots by him, by the Antichrist, are the kings of Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia, whom he cuts off in an array of battle. And he, after gaining terrible power over all, being nevertheless a tyrant, shall stir up tribulation and persecution against men, exalting himself against them. Well, where does he get this idea? For Daniel says, and then he quotes Daniel chapter 7, verses 21, and then he tacks on 11 just to complete his thought. But I considered the horn, and the horn made war with the saints, prevailed against them until the beast was slain, perished, and its body was given to the burning fire. So he doesn't actually quote that here, but he's talking about in chapter 11, where Daniel says that the Antichrist, the king of the north, is the Antichrist, and he attacks the king of the south, which is Egypt. And then it says Libya and Ethiopia come to the aid of Egypt, and they're all destroyed. Well, that's three nations. So Hippolytus is at the very least assuming three nations is three nations. So I don't know where he got the information. He doesn't say that John told me this directly, or, well, John wouldn't, but Polycarp or somebody, or that it's just his theory or whatever. He just says that that's what it is. So understanding that the 10 nations come from five toes on one foot and 5 toes on the other, and the feet and toes go with the legs, which is Western Rome and Eastern Rome, which is the Roman Latin Empire headquartered in Rome, and then the Byzantine Empire, which is Greek, headquartered from Constantinople. That may not mean anything, but it seems like there would be 5 Middle Eastern countries and 5 European countries or something like that. And basically he's saying Egypt would be a part of it. Now, Egypt is definitely a nation that comes against the Antichrist, and the Antichrist comes down and destroys Egypt. That's very, very clear in chapter 11 of Daniel. But he's pulling this together to say that if we look at Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia actually is the word Cush. So it's that area south of Egypt. We could be talking about Sudan, North or South Sudan, or Ethiopia proper, or anything like that. But basically, no matter how that works, we need to look at Egypt. And that's why I've always said when we're looking at 10 countries that might form the empire, Egypt's probably part of them. So maybe, maybe not, maybe he's wrong, but this is something to think about. But either way, if you understand he's saying this, he's obviously thinking this stuff is yet future. I'm here in 200 AD. Sometime way in the future, Rome will split and be legs for quite a while. And then somewhere along the line, they'll kind of diminish and come back and have 5 toes, 5 on one foot, 5 on the other. So, and this is all yet future. How far in the future? He's going to explain here in a minute. Then he talks about the stone, which is the Messianic kingdom. So if you stop here, you're liable to say, okay, well, the Messianic kingdom is when the Christians took over Rome and we're in the millennium now. Everything's fine. That's the amillennial view. And he doesn't exactly say that. And he doesn't exactly say the opposite at this. He's just identifying that the stone that was cut without hands that hit the image at its feet and destroyed it is it's not the church, it's the Messianic kingdom or that millennial reign. So, but again, if you want to make that symbolic, then you could do something else with it. But so let's look at the summaries here. Actually, let me go ahead and read this real quick. So the future 10 kingdoms. These things then are in the future, and the 10 toes of the image are equivalent to so many democracies. Okay, so little countries. And the 10 horns of the fourth beast are distributed over 10 kingdoms. And let us look at the subject a little more closely and consider these matters in the light of a clear personal survey. So this is his personal survey over it, his teaching, but he's going to explain why. So are these 10 kingdoms that were in the Middle Ages and were all millennial? Is it supposed to be in the year 6000 or a literal, pre-trib, pre-millennial concept? What does he think about that? So first, let's look at this. In chapter 28, he says the gold is a summary. So the golden head of the image and the lioness, both denote the Babylonians, the shoulders and arms of silver, and the bear represents the Medes and the Persians, the belly and thighs of brass, and the leopard mean the Greeks or the Grecian Empire. who held sovereignty from Alexander's time forward. And then the legs of iron and the beast that was nondescript, it was terrible, the eagle, expresses the Romans who currently hold sovereignty. So that's as far as we can go, because in 200 AD, we're still under Roman. It hasn't even split yet. So the prophecy is ongoing. And the toes of the feet, which were part of iron and part of clay, the 10 horns, both of these are the emblems of the kingdoms yet to rise. So the 10 horns and the 10 toes are the same thing. And so far, you should be saying, yeah, that's pretty much what I've always been taught and what seems logical. But we're trying to show you that that's always been taught that way. And then the other little horn that grows up amongst them is the Antichrist in their midst. So the Antichrist is yet future. He's not back. He's not Nero. He's not back in 200 AD. It's yet future after the Romans come into power. Well, they are in power now at this point, but after they split in two and then later on fragment into 10, then there will be an Antichrist. So that's way, way in the future in his period. And the stone that smites it is Christ. So at that point, you might say Christ the church or Christ the millennial reign, or what do you mean by Christ? And he goes on and talks about several other things. But let's just go through at this point and look at the titles anyway. Okay, let's stop there actually and run up to chapter 43. So he talks about a lot of things about the harlot and things like that, but let's go to the summary of the harlot. So this is what he says about, the harlot system in Revelation. First, in chapters 21 or 41 and 42, he's quoting the Isaiah prophecy and then the Revelation prophecy about the Babylonian mystery harlot. So now he gives a summary. With respect then to the particular judgment in the torments that are come upon it in the last times. So this revelation mystery religion is in the last times. Okay. By the hand of the tyrants who shall arise then, the clearest statement has been given in these passages in Isaiah and in Revelation. So those are the two main passages to study the Babylonian mystery religion in his mind. But it becomes us further diligently to examine and set forth the period in which these things will come to pass. So yeah, that'd be my question too. Was it hundreds of years ago? When does he think it's going to be? How the little horn will spring up in their midst? For when the legs of iron have issued in the feet and toes. So 395 is the split, and then somewhere along the line, the 10 come. Whenever that happens, according to the similitude and the image of that terrible beast, has been shown above, there shall be a time when the iron and the clay will be mingled together. And Daniel sets forth this subject to us. So Daniel explains when. For he says, and then he quotes Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that 1 week there will be a covenant with many, and it shall be in the midst of the week that my sacrifice and oblation shall cease. That's a loose quote. By 1 week, therefore, he meant the last week, which is at the end of the whole world. And of course, world there can mean age. We're talking about the end of the age of grace, because we know there's a millennial reign and stuff later. So look at this point then, this whole concept. And then the two prophets for 1,260 days, but the 1 week at the last is when this happens. So that last 7-year period right before that. Then he talks about the two advents of the Messiah. And let me go down to, okay, let's see. Chapter 50. This is one I want to read to you. 666. Here's what he says. By now we will speak of what is before us. For such measures he, talking about the Antichrist, will devise. Okay, so the prophet says, and he's quoting Revelation, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding count the number of the beast, For it's the number of a man, and his number is 666. With respect to his name, it is not in our power to explain it exactly. So you can't figure it out. There might be 3 or 4 different names that equal 666. And you'd have to find the guy and the country and be at that time period to find him. So you can't exactly say for sure, he's saying. As the blessed John understood it and was instructed about it, but only gave a conjectural account of it, it appears then that the Blessed One will show us what we seek to know. Yet, so far as our doubtful apprehension matter goes, as we may speak, many names indeed we find the letters which are equivalent of this number. So there's several names that equal 666. He says, for instance, the word Titan. It's an ancient and noble name, or Evanthus. It too makes up the same number. So somebody named Titan, somebody named Evanthus, somebody named something else could equal 666. Well, which one of those is the name of the Antichrist? Well, we don't know. It's just a name that happens to equal 666. Several others might be found that. But as we have already said, the wound of that first beast was healed, and he, the second beast, made the image to speak, that it would be powerful. It is manifest to all that those at the present still hold the power are the Latins, the Roman Empire. Okay. So in other words, Rome hasn't even split yet. So there's no way we can look for 10 nations, and we can't look for the Antichrist until we see 10 nations. So it's out there a ways, he's saying. If then we take the name of a single man, it becomes Latinus. So Latinus actually equals 666. So we ought neither to give this out as if it were certainly his name, nor again ignore the fact that he may not be otherwise designated, but have the mystery in our heart. We talked about how Irenaeus actually wrote to Polycarp and asked him what John said about it. And basically he said, well, number one, you can't identify, because there's a lot of people that equal 666 in their name. You can't identify the Antichrist until you understand that he rules a country north of Israel, and it's during a time when there's a coalition of 10 kings. Where the 10 kings are, we don't know, but there's this 10-nation empire. That's when you go looking for the Antichrist. But the 10 kings can't come until Rome splits. And Rome hasn't even split yet into the 2 legs. So it's a ways off. So there's no way we can even begin to identify that. Now, in our time, Rome has split, and we're waiting for the 10 nations to arise. And they arise, as he's just said, in that last week, that 70th week of Daniel, which ends with the second coming. So we're seeing this, that he's obviously a premillennial person, not amillennial or postmillennial. So let's just go through these a little bit, and I want to look at 2 other passages in detail, just kind of showing you that there's a lot of stuff in here to read, but still. Chapter 51, he talks about Jordan falling to the Antichrist. It talks about that in Daniel, where it says Edom, Moab, and Ammon escape out of the Antichrist's hands. Well, what happens is those 3 countries come together to form their own country, and that's already happened. Today we call that Transjordan. So Edom, Moab, and Ammon are one country. Now they can do or not do something collectively. And so that happens. And he talks about that prophecy and how Tyre and Beirut fall to the Antichrist. So in one of these passages, he's taken from the Old Testament, and he's meaning that the Antichrist, the very first of the peoples, the first battle that the Antichrist does when he comes, apparently is in Beirut. We're talking about Lebanon, Tyre and Beirut and Lebanon. Lebanon's always been a hotbed for wars. And how many wars have we had with Beirut involved? Tyre, not so much, but Beirut. So it's interesting. Again, I don't know where he's getting this, but it's definitely something worth looking at. And he's not saying that Beirut's got anything to do with the 10 nations. It's just the Antichrist attacks and destroys many, many nations. He takes over. So, but he's identifying the first couple of battles is Beirut, Lebanon, and something with Jordan. Jordan, he doesn't actually attack them. According to his understanding, Jordan just flat surrenders. He's like, okay, we're in. Maybe they're one of the 10 nations, and they just, sure. So he doesn't have to attack them, but he doesn't attack Jordan, but he does attack Beirut. Talks about the pride of the Antichrist and all sorts of other descriptions about him, pieces of it. And then let's see, we want to go up to chapter 64. Let me just keep going here. He's called the Assyrian in one passage. He does things with the Jews. He does something with the country of Ethiopia. And then there's something about the sun-clad woman, abomination of desolation. And we want to get to here. I want to show you this. So here's the one that kind of pulls it all together. So the concept that there's a 7-year period, he's already said that, and it's during that 7-year period that we have these 10 nations. And the 10 nations may exist for many years before, but it's in this 7-year time period, the last 7 years of our age, as he said, is when those 10 nations will come together and not be able to work too well, but the Antichrist will do his stuff. So now he's talking about that 7-year tribulation and saying that there's 2 halves to the tribulation. This is really important because when we were looking last week at Ephraim and then Irenaeus, they both made it very clear that the rapture of the church happens before the tribulation begins, period. No way around that. Question is, did they mean the last 3.5 years or the last 7 years as the tribulation or the Great Tribulation? So here we have Hippolytus describing that there's the tribulation period, and it can be divided into 2 pieces, 2 sets of 3.5 years. So in his mind, at least, the tribulation is a 7-year period, not a 3.5. So if the tribulation is a 7-year period, we're not talking about the Great Tribulation, that last piece of it, but if we're talking about the entire 7-year period, and the rapture of the church happens before that 7-year period begins, we're pre-tribulational. So there's no way around it, unless you're going to say he meant one thing and the other guy meant something else. I mean, you can always try to find a way to make it fit something different, but if they're consistent, and this is, we're just looking at prophecy, but you can do this with just about anything. What did they teach about the gifts of the Spirit? Salvation, could you lose it or not? What about the scriptures and the Antichrist and just all sorts of different things? And you'll find that in the first 2 centuries, if they talk about it, some people don't even mention prophecy, but out of some 40 church fathers, if they talk about it, they all say the same thing. And when you get somebody to say something even slightly different, they're immediately attacked as a heretic. Okay. So with that in mind, somebody would be highly arguing about him right now if that wasn't the common teaching. You get kicked out of your denomination, so to speak, if you teach something different. And so that's what's really neat about it. And then you get into the 3rd century and you got lots of different opinions, and everybody says, well, this is what we've always taught. And you're wondering how they got it, And I think it's mainly from the persecutions. Paul talks about how you don't let a novice be a pastor in a position of authority. But when all the pastors are executed, what else are you going to do? Pick a new guy. There's no old guys left. They've all been executed. So after the persecutions, that's when you get the new people in that don't quite know what they're doing, and they take wild guesses and they write, and then you get the different ideas. So the 2 halves of the tribulation, these things then being come to pass, beloved, 1 week is divided into 2 parts. And the abomination of desolation being manifested then, and the 2 prophets, and the forerunners of the Lord having finished their course, the whole world finally approaching the consummation, just simply remains the coming of our Lord. So he's saying that there's a 7-year period, 2 sets, 3.5, And in the middle, we got the death of the two witnesses and the abomination of desolation. So he's describing that whole 7-year period, just like Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2 is describing that whole period, which means a pre-trib rapture. Okay, and so then he says, he gives us a couple quotes for that. And then let's see here. So by the heat, he means, he's quoting the other passages, he means the conflagration, so all the really bad stuff at the end of the tribulation. Isaiah speaks thus, come, my people, enter into thy chamber, and shut the door, and hide yourself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation of our Lord be overpast. And in like manner, Paul says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth of God in unrighteousness. So what he's saying here is that, again, this idea of the people of God come into the chamber, and the word here in Hebrew for chamber actually means wedding chamber. So we are the bride of Christ, and we are to enter that chamber and shut the door and hide until the indignation is overpast, the time of indignation or the trouble. And again, that's where we everybody agrees that that's talking about the tribulation period that I know of. But the question is, are we talking about the 7-year period or the 3.5-year period to be a mid-trib or a pre-trib, And obviously, from what he's saying, he's very clearly pre-trib, because in his mind, the tribulation period has two halves, and they're on the opposite sides of the abomination of desolation. So really, really clear on this. Okay, and then there should be a summary. Let me look at the summary part here. Then he talks more about the rapture. Okay, so here's the summary of his book on the Antichrist. So he says that the scripture calls him the Assyrian. His name equals 666 when spelled out in Greek. Some possible names are Titan, Avanthus, and Latanus. He teaches that Rome was the mystery Babylon in his day, and somehow continues to exist past the destruction of the two Roman empires. So when Eastern and Western Rome falls, and they have fallen now, at least as far as 1917 for sure, or maybe not. They're just trying to die. You've got Russia doing stuff, but basically, somehow past 1917, we have a continuation of a Babylonian mystery, something or other. Anyway, the 10 nations originate out of the area that used to be the old Roman Empire and what used to be the old Grecian Empire, which is actually kind of the same place. Israel exists today as a democracy, but the Antichrist will revive a religious state in Israel. That doesn't really mean much because he's going to claim to be God, so everything he does is a religious thing. Let's see here. So the basic outline is Jerusalem destroyed by Rome. There 70 AD is the temple. Antichrist born of the circumcision. Again, not sure what that means exactly. Born of the tribe of Dan. Restores the Roman Empire from 4 pieces. We didn't cover that, but that's one of the odd things that he says that, I'm not sure where he's getting it, but it's interesting. And that's the neat thing about this, because we can look at this and say, okay, so far the basic outline is exactly what we've always been taught. So we know Daniel 2, we know Daniel 7, we know Daniel 11 and Daniel 9. We know exactly what they mean. We got all the dates for when those things happened up to today. We don't know future stuff. So, and he's believed the same. So far, we've seen that everybody believes in a premillennial concept, a 7-year tribulation ending with the second coming, which starts that literal 1,000-year reign, a literal Antichrist, 10 nations, and Daniel's prophecies explain it. And then he goes forward with that, and then a rapture of the church, apparently pre-trib. And again, we don't know if that's 5 minutes before or 10 years before, so we can't really date that in any way, shape, or form. but the basic idea behind it. So then the 7 years begin, and the rapture of believers occurs. Antichrist raises up a Jewish a kingdom, a religious one of some sort, changes the government basically of Israel, helps to build a Jerusalem temple. The two witnesses come. The wars begin. Jordan submits to the Antichrist. Tyre and Beirut fall to the Antichrist, and then he destroys Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. And that's for sure out of Daniel. Whether they're the three nations or not is the question, but that happens. And then the 10 nations destroy what's left of Babylon. Whether that's Roman Catholicism or what that is, he doesn't say in his mind, but that's the outline. And then you've got the temple sacrifices stopped, the abomination set up that lasts 1290 days, persecution of believers begin. Again, not raptured believers, but tribulation saints. And then at the end of the 7 years, we have the beginning of the millennial reign. So that's the basic outline I wanted to cover tonight. So as you can see, this is 67 chapters in this particular book. That's big for one of the ancient books. So far we've looked at Ephraim's end times. Hippolytus is the Antichrist. Next week, we're going to look at one more book of Hippolytus, and it's called On the End of the World, or the End of the Age. And there's several interesting things in here. It's not quite as long. It's only 41 chapters, but we're going to look at some of the interesting things in there. They've got a lot of interesting things about signs of the end times that I would like to focus on. So anyway, we'll do that then.